good afternoon or good evening, and welcome all of you to this policy lecture, which is part of the Barcelona GSE Forum. As you know, because most of you are participating in this event, the Barcelona GSE Forum is a meeting that we are doing for the second time, and that we hope we're going to be doing for a long time, that puts together a bunch of workshops on different areas on economics. It puts it together in the same time, in the same place, so that we can all interact more, so that it creates the sort of externalities and agglomerations that we always put in our models to get the results that we like. So this is what we are doing here. In the context of this Barcelona GSE Forum, we decided to organize a couple of events, policy events, that would go a little bit further than the technical discussions that we have in the context of our particular workshops and within our particular groups. And this year, we decided to do two of them. The second one, which is not the one we're going to have right now, is going to be next Tuesday, just for you to know, exactly in this same place. And there's going to be a panel discussion about from policy to evidence and back on education and migration. So we will have a bunch of experts talking about education and migration and immigration and what we know about that and policy and so on. So you are all invited to be back here next Tuesday on June 17th. But today we have the first of those events, and this event today, it is a great pleasure. It's a great pleasure for me, it's a great pleasure for all of us to welcome back Fabrizio Zilibotti. Professor Fabrizio Zilibotti started his professional career at Universitat Pompeu Fabra, so we're very proud, and that's the first thing I wanted to say right away to make sure that all of you that didn't know that, you know it now. Fabrizio did his PhD at LSE, came here to Pompeu Fabra afterwards, and then he has been a series of universities. He's been at Stockholm, he's been at University College London, he's been at Southampton, and now he's at the University of Zurich, not necessarily in that order, but now he's a chair of macroeconomics and political economy at the Department of Economics at the University of Zurich. Fabrizio is one of the top macroeconomists of his generation, and his work reflects high originality and high productivity in many areas. This is why he has earned so many awards. He's the elected president of the European Economic Association for the year 2016. He's the, I cannot pronounce this, Joe Jansson Award from the European Economic Association. He has won the Sun Yifang Award from the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences for some of the work that he's going to be presenting here. He has been managing editor and director of some of the most prestigious reviews, like the Review of Economic Studies and the Journal of the European Economic Association, as he is doing now. All these awards is for a very long and very productive research career that include papers in the areas of economic growth. That's where most of his early work and continuing work starts. Some of this work joined with some of the faculty here, like Gino Gancia here sitting. He also has a lot of work. He did early work on unemployment with also Ramon Marimon, unemployment in Spain. It would be nice, Fabrizio, if you go back to work on this, because this is badly needed right now again. He has done work also with Jordi Galí in the past, so he has a tradition of writing with some of our faculty as well. He has done work on political economy. His work on political economy, for example, on the welfare state, on democracies, and so on, is one of the most original ones that has been done in the last few years. He is now starting and doing a lot of interesting work on civil conflict and conflict within countries. This morning I had the luck of hearing him give a talk on exactly this topic. It was very, very interesting. But the work that he's going to present today is his work on China. Actually, Fabrizio, together with Song and Storesletten, wrote a paper, Growing Like China, that has become the seminal paper in the area. After that, he has followed up with some work, and some of that work is what Fabrizio is going to be presenting here today. So without, I just have one thing that I was told by the organization to say, is that do not forget to say that at the end of the talk, there's going to be a glass of cava in a room just in the back. So all of you are invited. Please stay, and you will have a chance to have this glass of cava. Now, the format of the presentation will be, Fabrizio will come and talk about 50 minutes, 55, something like this, and then he will take questions from the floor. Okay? So without further ado, I would like to welcome Fabrizio Zilibotti here. Thank you very much, Fabrizio, for coming.
So it's my greatest pleasure to be back in Barcelona, and I want to thank the organizer, particularly Jaume, also for this overly generous introduction. And yes, I was told today to give something which is not the format of a standard academic presentation, and I thought I would use as the base of this a review article that I prepared joint with Cheta Stores-Letten for the annual review of economics, which summarizes actually not only our own work, but some of the research. And here the research is growing, so I will not by any means try to be comprehensive, but I will just try to give some highlight. So actually we started working on the basis of one of these European Research Council grants that there are many people here in Barcelona also have been awarded a few years ago. And then we started by launching a conference, and this was the logo of the first such conference. This is a view of the Pudong area. These were the new development in Shanghai. This impressive set of impressive buildings, and for many years I have used this to give an idea of the development, the modernization of China. Then I became suspicious because every time I go there, everything changes. So I said, well, let's look for a more recent picture, and this is what I found. Now, you see, there are two things here that are different. The first is the amount of new modern building, skyscrapers, etc. This is the real part of the development of China. The second is the color of the sky. And I would say that this is not necessarily the real part. And sometimes when you deal with Chinese data, you have to worry. So I'm not questioning that this is a true image. There is a couple of days a year it can be like that. It has never happened to me to be in Shanghai and to see it. I hope it will be like this. But that was a note on which I wanted to start. And so let me give you a few statistics that most of you actually certainly know, but I think that put in a context my discussion. So China is a large country, and by large, it means a population of 1.34 billion people, which is now somehow stabilizing at that level. If you put together the set of Western-like democracy, European Union, United States, Japan, and other Western offshoots, as people call them, well, then you have a number that goes to about 1 billion people. So China alone is larger than that. It's larger than the whole of the African continent. So its economic size obviously makes not China to be something different, something more than a particular country. Again, it's a large area of the world. So you may have read in these days in the press, the Financial Times a few weeks ago talk about alleged surpass of China in terms of total GDP relative to the United States. I don't know about that particular estimate. Something that is clear is that if you take the data evaluated at exchange rate, one still gets the impression that China is a much smaller economy in terms of total GDP than the United States or the European Union. In reality, when you make PPP adjustment, and here again there is a lot of uncertainty about the size of that adjustment, but China is about the size of the United States and of the European Union. So there are like three giants in the world in terms of world economy, and this is China, US, and EU. Well, from being China so much larger, when you translate this in level of economic development as measured, for instance, by PPP adjusted GDP per capita, this is from the World Bank, well, still China is a significantly poorer country than the Western world. It's about 20% the level of the United States. Actually, China, so I want to emphasize this because every day you read in the press about supposedly crisis, slowdown of economic growth. I will say something about this. Well, there is an enormous potential still for China to grow in the most traditional way, by essentially adopting technologies that still China does not use, improving the efficient allocation of resources, further accumulating capital. So all of this is still very much possible for China. So sometimes one hears a strange comparison. China sometimes is compared to Japan in the 1980s, before this country that was growing very fast hit the wall or get into a prolonged stagnation. But Japan was a much more developed economy at that time relative to the world technology frontier than is China today. So China GDP per capita is about half the GDP per capita of Russia, to make a comparison. So another aspect is how the growth trajectory of China has evolved. If you take China at the end of the 1970s, it was one of the poorest areas in the world. It was one of the absolutely poorest countries in the world. Its GDP per capita was in the order of 4 to 5% the GDP of the United States or of other Western economies. That level of underdevelopment came from actually far back before the start of the communist regime. During the communist regime, there was no convergence, essentially, as you can see from this picture, where you see the GDP per capita as a percentage of the United States. So there were a lot of oscillation associated with a number of tragic events, like the Great Famine in the beginning of the 1960s. This is the Cultural Revolution. But you see, altogether, there was no sign of convergence. Then economic reforms were introduced in 1979, and you see a clear breaking point. China started to converge. There was a crisis in the late 1980s. This was the time of the Tiananmen Square that you certainly remember. And then there's been a sharp acceleration towards the end of the 1990s. And in the last 10 years, the growth rate has been, there are different estimates here, 9.5% per year if you take the World Bank, 8% if you take the Penn World Table. It's also interesting to see what it means in terms of comparison with other countries. Here you see 4 large economies: Brazil, China, India, and Nigeria. In the 1970s, China was the poorest of these countries. Nowadays, China is more than twice as rich in terms of GDP per capita as India, and it's approaching a number of middle-income economies at the level of Brazil, or even at the level of the lower end of the European Union. Now, it's a common view that China has grown, yes, but that this growth has gone at the advantage of a small share of its population. In this statement, there is some little truth and a lot of misperception. So the truth is that inequality has grown big time during these 30 years. But as a matter of fact, the effect of growth has been so predominant that poverty has been largely eradicated. So if it is true that China went from a situation where there is no almost no inequality, to a situation where China has the same level of inequality as the United States, although very different in composition. It's more urban, rural, etc. But if you look at the figures about the share of population living in extreme poverty, well, in 1980 it was in the order of 84%, and today it's below 10%. The exact numbers are sometimes questioned. There are issues about the appropriate deflator. When you think that people are not consuming the same basket of goods, some studies argue, in fact, that the relative price of the goods that very poor people consume has increased. That all may be true and can make this picture slightly less extreme, but still quite substantial. China also was a very closed economy. Essentially, it did not participate in foreign trade. Today, it is the largest exporting economy, at least if you don't count the European Union as a single economy. So, as I was mentioning, growth has accelerated significantly over the last decade, but since 2012, we have observed some slowdown. I mean, China did spectacularly well during the international Great Recession, partly because of policy intervention and because there was abundance of resources. Now, what we see today is an economic growth in the area of 7.5%. IMF forecasts that it will go down to 7% in 2015. I would like to emphasize that these are, by historical comparison. So, for instance, when we think about the success of the four Asian tigers in the 1980s, it's still extremely high growth rates, and there is no theory, I believe, that would suggest that the growth rate should be as high as 10% in order to be a success story in terms of economic growth. So in our survey, in our review article, we cover like 3 areas. So first, we discuss the root of Chinese poverty before the reforms, starting from the observation that China for longer period in human history has actually been the technological leading areas in the world. And there are studies that show that by historians, Pomerant for instance, that at the end of the 18th century, still the average living condition in the richest area of China was comparable to the average living condition in the richest area of Europe at the time. So much of the divergence, what Pomerant calls the Great Divergence, took place from then and onwards. And it is a story of partly of political decline, of the unsuccessful attempt of the imperial government to stop or to limit trade with the West, of a form of bringing trade to China from the West that was not necessarily friendly. It took the shape of a series of wars, for instance, the Opium War. So it was political instability. It was also demographically different from what we have seen in Europe. So there was, like in Europe, an expansion of productivity in agriculture, but instead of giving rise to urbanization and industrialization, it gave rise to a boom in the population, something that arguably has been firm in the minds of the reformers in China in recent times, when they thought that putting constraints on demographic policy would for some reason help. I will not have the time to talk about this today, and instead I will focus on the second and the third point. The second is, what brought about this boom of growth since 1979, and so also I will try to say something about the future of the Chinese economy. So everything started with a set of reforms. The first were approved in December 1978. That transformed China in the 1980s into a mixed economy, which continued to be largely a socialist planned economy for what concerned the majority of the areas and of the population, but with important element of change, especially in some area, but also more generally in agriculture. Now, what one has to understand, which is also from the economic analysis, a bit of an element of a frustration, is that some of these policies were introduced in a sort of informal way, and in particular the household responsibility system that led in a matter of a few years to decollectivization of agriculture was a very important element in bringing about an increase in productivity and resolve the most dramatic problem, that was the food production of China. But it's very hard to use any source of variation to understand how exactly it mattered. The same is the development of township and village enterprises, which were somehow detached. These were enterprises that were detached from the rigid system of state control by giving more power to the municipalities or to the collective of workers that own these firms. And in some cases, they were managed essentially already as private enterprises. We know that they were exceptionally productive relative to the rest of the firms. But again, there is an issue with measuring these forces. Now, the third was the introduction of the one-child policy I've already briefly mentioned. One area where there is more hope is the policy of that was very characteristic of the Chinese reformers, the introduction of special economic zones. So special economic zones was a strategy of introducing market economy progressively and only in limited areas, and this was done in a staggered fashion. So we can observe both the variation across space and also the variation over time of this policy, and I will say more about this. But let me continue in a quick description of the main event before getting to focus more on deeper causes. So the 1980s, there was a period in which Chinese economy started growing faster, but towards the end of the decade, the growth underwent a significant slowdown and was accompanied by political crisis. The emergence of a number of cases of corruption and a big division inside the Communist Party. So the Communist Party divided itself between those who thought that even the limited experiments in the 1980s had been responsible actually for leaving the right way, which at the time was identified with the principle of Marxist socialism. Others thought that much more was needed. And this went into a clash of individual personalities. For instance, Hu Yaobang was one of the most pro-reform leader. And in 1989, after the death of Hu Yaobang, a series of protests started, protests actually of different type, that culminated in the slaughter of Tiananmen Square on the army, killing a lot of students, as you remember. Now, this was, in this period, the most important political leader was Deng Xiaoping. Deng Xiaoping actually wanted to go far in terms of economic reforms, and in fact, in the end, he brought about more pronounced reforms. At the same time, he kept a very ambiguous or even negative position when it came to political reform and introduction of elements of democracy. In any case, this period of crisis that started in around 1988, it ended in 1992 when Deng Xiaoping made a tour in the south of the countries where he announced in a sort of informal way, as it often happened with Chinese leaders, he announced the new impulse of the process of economic reform and the need to introduce more element of market economy. Now, the 1990s was the decade. It was not the decade with the highest growth, but it was the decade where most of the fundamental reform took place. In contrast, the last decade was a decade of success, arguably related to this process of economic reform that took place before, but there was no major economic and nor political reform. So the leadership of Hu Jintao is regarded as a leadership of conservatism in terms of both economic and political reform. Now, in the 1990s, it's the time when fully private enterprises owned by domestic residents started being an important actor in the process of economic growth. So first they allowed foreign investment, especially attracting them in the area called special economic zones I mentioned before, but then subsequently there was first tolerance and then endorsement of private initiative and private property of the means of production. So the blessing of the Communist Party came actually when this was already an undergoing process. It was at the 15th Congress of the Communist Party of China in 1997 that launched the slogan, grab the large enterprise, release the small one, that essentially made it explicit, made it official doctrine that state-owned enterprises would no longer be protected by the government at any cost, and they should show through the law of the market that they are sufficiently efficient to work. Now, as I will argue later, it's not that the rules were always fair. Many of these firms benefit from significant state support, but until that time, there was no issue about even the survival of these firms. There was a big expansion of the special economic zones in 1992. There was the first housing market reform. Houses were publicly owned, were essentially granted, not all of them, but a large share of them, by firms to their own workers, and these were privatized, and that created, of course, big changes, arguably also related to the patterns of savings. In 1997, there was the first pension reforms, again related to the privatization of firms. Before then, firms would continue to pay a modest pension to the workers after the workers had retired, but now some firms could cease to exist, and for that reason, the pension system had to be organized in a different way. It was also the time when China started accumulating a significant foreign surplus, and in 2001, it was the entry of the WTO. Well, here you see how the share of private firm in manufacturing has actually evolved. Here there are two alternative measures. Let me not dwell on the details here, but here you see the share of the share of employment in private enterprise in the manufacturing sector. Essentially, it went from something like 10% in 1998 up to about 60% around 2006, and since then it has somehow stagnated actually. Now, let me now go a little more in detail, so from the big picture, trying to focus on some facts that come out of research. So I'm going to talk about industrial policy and some empirical research we have been doing on the special economic zones. I'm going to talk about political incentives and growth based on actually someone else's work, and later I'm going to talk about the article that Jaume kindly mentioned before. So this is what I'm going to say is based on joint research with Simon Alder. I'm sorry, it is misspelled, Alder, who is here, so why I'm so careful. I know where. And he's there. And Lin Shao. In other places, I have not made this point. So the preconditions of this was the large technological backwardness and the isolation from international trade, and the fact that in the 1970s there were essentially no foreign direct investments. The goal of this policy was explicitly to attract foreign investment and to foster economic development. There was also this element that was so characteristic of the Chinese policymaker strategy, which is to go by experimentation. So to learn from something done at a small local level and consider whether this should be expanded to other areas, gradual implementation. So typically, although there is variation, and in the study, of course, we discussed this in much more detail, the type of treatment that these zones were subject to were tax exemption, less restrictive regulation of foreign exchange, lower land use prices, and also more generally, the local leadership was given much more autonomy in designing policy. For instance, in Shenzhen, back in the 1980s, there was the first introduction of a labor market, when before then people were just assigned essentially to job by the planner. I want to say that although this may feel something of the past, first of all, I will show you that it's a policy that has been used throughout the decades, even in the last 10 years. But more importantly, even today, the current debate, which is focusing specifically on financial reforms, they continue to use this instrument of experimenting new policies at a local level. So this is something that continues to be well present in the mind of the policymakers in China. So let me give you an idea of how these special economic zones were introduced over the year by this slideshow. So this is in the beginning, there were 5 special economic zones were introduced in the East Coast. Then in 1998, there was an expansion that was still limited to the East Coast. In 1992, there was the introduction of a large number of new special economic zones, mostly in inland China, that continued through 2000, 2005, 2010. And you see that now many areas have the status of special economic zones. Of course, the treatment was in some way more profound in the earlier days, when China was otherwise a non-market economy than it is today, but it continues to be important to be granted the status of special economic zones. So how can one assess the effect of the zones, and what are the problems that one has to face? Well, there is something nice about these special economic zones, that is the fact that there is variation both across space and over time. So the fact that zones were introduced in different moments allow us to exploit that type of variation, and not only to compare treated versus non-treated cities. We have data that are available at a very local level. So we have data at the prefectural city level on all the urban areas of China. Now, these data are subject to some quibbles, and we try to do our best to address that. And I will tell you in a moment why. So there are somehow 2 issues. The first, and I would say, nothing perfect can be done to solve them, but something can be done at least to ameliorate or to limit the concerns. Well, the first is that if we make a naive comparison between special economic zone and non-special economic zones, there are a number of studies that have looked at that. Well, special economic zones typically tend to grow faster than non-special economic zone cities, but clearly zones are not selected randomly. So in particular in the 1980s, they were chosen strategically close to ports, close to Hong Kong, in areas that arguably would have been economically successful. Also, in the absence of those economic zones, it seems natural that they wanted to see the experiment done in the best possible condition. Well, the other issue, which I've already mentioned, is to what extent we can trust the data. So what we do is the following. Well, first of all, because we have data at such a granular level, so we can even distinguish between core city areas and area which is urban but that surround the city center, we can filter out a lot of heterogeneity. For instance, we can control for city fixed effect, and we can control also for some shocks that are time varying at a larger level of aggregation like the province. So that somehow avoid the naive comparison of areas in the rich east coastal area with poorer area in the center or in the west of China. Since there is variation over time, we can exploit a within estimator. So we can compare the trend of each cities before and after the onset of the special economic zones using essentially a difference in difference estimator. We can check the robustness of the result in a sample of cities that were granted the special economic zone status on the basis of rigid administrative criteria, particularly cities that were capitals of provinces in the inland areas. So there was less discretion than otherwise. Of course, one can see if the capitals were, as a group, doing already different from the rest of the cities, but that's something that somehow we can control for. So we can control for pre-reform trends, and we can also perform some placebo exercise. So we can see, well, suppose that the cities were assigned to the treatment in different period of time than when they've actually been assigned, what would we get? If there are some, it's just a trend that depends on something else, it shouldn't make a big difference, but here the idea is to try to make sure that what we identify is really the effect of the introduction of special economic zones. There are other issues that concern the quality of the data at the city level, and here what we do, we check the robustness of our result when instead of using the official statistic, we use satellite light data. So satellites record the amount of light that you have in different areas. Economic development tends to be correlated with the amount of light that during nighttime is visible, and we find that actually there is a surprisingly high correlation between these data that there are many reasons to believe might be noisy and the actual satellite light data. There is also another issue that it could be that spillovers are important. So it could be that special economic zones attract resources but impoverish neighboring areas. And here we can use the fact that we have data at a very granular level, so we can look at each city, compare its economic outcome with what happens in the area surrounding the city that was not treated, that was not given the status of special economic zones. And in short, what we find is that there is crowding in rather than crowding out. Now we plan to do more on this issue of spillovers, but this seems to be an indication that if anything, the areas close to special economic zones that were not special economic zones did better on average when the special economic zones were introduced. Well, here it's a summary of the several regressions that we ran, where essentially we allow each of the year before and after the reform to have a specific effect that is identified by our difference in difference regression. So this is a very flexible specification, where, for instance, we can see that already before the reform, these cities were doing slightly better, but not much. And then there is a very reasonable build-up effect, which in the end flattens out. So what we estimate is that the treatment corresponds to an increase in the GDP of the treated area and the GDP per capita also between 17 and 20%. Well, here is just to give you an idea of the use of light. This is the type of exercise we do. Here are two cities, Shenyang and Foshun. Shenyang was actually Shenyang is the city that was treated. Foshun was never became a special economic zones, and you see over time that the development of Shenyang, which is this city, becomes bigger, whereas Foshun, in terms of light, grows but less so. It's just an illustration. So we can also learn something about the channel of this policy, and these channels are more foreign investment, more investment from domestic firms. So there is a strong effect on capital accumulation. There is also some effect on human capital, though not major. The quality of the composition of the population in this area improves relative to the rest. And there are some effects on productivity. So total factor productivity increases differentially in the treated region. So it looks as if the foreign investment have carried with them some effect on productivity, or maybe it was a reallocation. This we don't have a way of saying on this data. So the next topic I wanted to talk more briefly. This is a paper by Rui Xie, who is a former student at Stockholm University. Currently, she is at University of California, San Diego, and she did a very interesting study because everyone, there is a strong prior that the change of career incentive within the Communist Party of China must have been responsible for this growth boom. So the narrative says, well, before the success in the party career was related essentially to ideological loyalty or personal loyalty to one leader versus another, the system of incentive has moved in the direction of providing promotion based on the performance. And this has somehow worked as a substitute for some of the check and balances that typically are at work in democracy and that in dictatorship are typically missing. Now, one of the points that she emphasizes is that this policy of growth at any cost may actually have had its dark side. And the first picture that I showed gives an idea of this. We know that if we travel to China, there is a very big gap, not only in the average level of life condition of the population, but also in the average environmental standards. And some studies have shown that across China, 99% of the urban dwellers breathe air that would be considered unsafe by the EU. There is severe heavy metal pollution in waters, etc. So GIA documents that the local leaders' promotion within the Communist Party actually relies on two things. One is the growth performance, so you have performed well, it's more likely that you are promoted. Well, the other is to have good connections. That's not an unfamiliar story for people, someone from Italy like me, and maybe Spain has also some of that. So success depends to a large extent on connection, and what she tests formally is the hypothesis that when a local leader is well connected, he has an incentive to push hard for growth success, disregarding environmental concern. Now, of course, the fact of having connection may be endogenous, so maybe a result rather than a cause, but she goes around this problem by a clever identification strategy. So she looks at connections that were established in early times, like to go to school in the same city and the same area, and if someone that you have known where you were very young, so nobody had already made a career, turns into the standing committee of the Politburo, which is the highest level of the highest political level in China. Well, that connection, from the point of view of the other person, is random, she argues. So it's random because it happens not thanks to some action undertaken by the other person, but it happens somehow for other reasons. And then she studies what is the effect of being subject to this type of random shock on the outcome in the area where the local leader is actually ruling. What she finds is the following, that when a governor becomes connected, there is a growth in industrial GDP in excess of the other regions of the order of 15%, which is quite large. But at the same time, there is an increase in chemical oxygen demand in industrial wastewater, 25%, and a large increase in sulfur dioxide in the air, 10%. So this study suggests that growth is important for career, but then it is pursued at the expenses of environmental standard, maybe by disregarding laws or relaxing even legal environmental standards. And I think this is very interesting, especially because currently there is a lot of debate also inside the Communist Party of China about changing the nature of the growth process. Next, I want to talk about growing like China, the study that I did together with Cheda Storrs-Letten and Song Zheng. This is a paper where somehow we try to understand the nature of the process of transition that started in 1992 with the process of market reforms, and that went on after the 15th Congress of the Communist Party throughout the process of privatization that I mentioned before. So there are a number of strong macroeconomic irregularities, which are the fact that the rate of return to investment was very high and remained high without any tendency to decline over time. Now, one presumption from theory would be that if at some point you allow the process of capital accumulation to start, and capital accumulation, as many people say, is the main engine of the process of economic growth, well, the rate of return may be very high at the beginning, because you can start, maybe the economy starts from a very bad situation with a lot of misallocated resources, but then the rate of return should decline over time, and that's something that we do not observe. It was high growth, a persistent trade surplus, and staggering wage growth, especially in the 90s. Now the situation is actually changing, but also over the last 10 years, wage growth on average has remained significantly below the productivity growth. So during this period, China has accumulated a large amount of foreign assets, which are mostly held in the form of low-yield foreign reserve. So about $4 trillion is the amount of reserve that is controlled by the central bank of China. Now, this has been described as somehow a puzzle because given that the investment in China commands a very high rate of returns, one should expect that on net capital moves into China rather than leaving China. Now, there are institutional factors that can limit that. For instance, portfolio investment into China are constrained, are not free, but foreign investment are quite free and welcome. So one would expect altogether China to be attracting capital. Instead, it has turned out to be, by and large, an exporter. And one debate that has been going on is the extent to which this is an outcome of a spontaneous outcome, or it is the result of some type of regulation or of intentional policy. People have talked about new mercantilism of the Chinese authorities that somehow might have an incentive to accumulate, to push the export-oriented growth. Now, rather, I will not try to argue the pros and cons of the alternative theory, but just to quickly explain what we do. So we start from the macroeconomic identity by which the gap between export and import is equal to the difference between savings and investment. So the foreign surplus, the trade surplus, can be viewed as an excess of savings over the investment. Now in China, investments have been very, very high. It's a country with a very high investment rate, but savings have accumulated even more than investment. So why do Chinese people save so much? There is an entire literature about that, and we review this in the article. It could be for precautionary reasons, some people have argued. It could be related to the process of housing market reform. It could be related to the family planning and one-child policy that have taken away from Chinese people the security of relying on a child in old age. It could be gender imbalance. A number of hypotheses have been explored and papers have been written on that. So this is the aggregate picture where you see that actually investment went up dramatically, especially since 2000, but savings have increased even further. So here the question is, well, if there were so much savings, why wouldn't they fuel even more investment, given the high rate of return of investment in the manufacturing sector, rather than ending up being parked in low-yield bonds? And the explanation that we provide is related to the fact that the banking system in China works in a very distorted way. Partly because it is largely owned by the state, and there is so these are the four largest banks are state-owned banks, and there is a strong entrenchment between this bank and the system of state-owned enterprises. Private enterprises, large enterprises, receive to some extent external financing, but the bulk of the private sector is heavily financially constrained. So to some extent, what it looks is that as if the banking system altogether fails to channel the growing savings of families to private enterprises, and specifically to those enterprises that happen to be the most dynamic and the most productive. If you look at the data, the private firms are those characterized by the highest productivity growth. And the result is a saving glut. So here we can see that over time, here you see the picture that I gave you before of saving and investment broken down into corporate and household sector. There is also the government sector that doesn't play a huge role here. But what you see is that the corporate sector is a net, on net absorb resources. The solid line is investment and the dashed line is savings. So the dashed line for the corporate sector is retained earnings, if you like. And you see that over time, the amount of investment that is financed from outside, it's actually falling. The fact that the gap is shrinking, it shows that more and more of the total investment by corporation, by firms, is actually financed through retained earnings. The opposite is true when you look at households. Well, households they save, they also own some asset, and the difference between savings and they also own some capital goods, and the difference between saving and investment that you see here is characterized by an increasing gap. So the net savings, if you want, of the families is increasing, and the net amount of those that is absorbed by the corporates, the domestic firms in China is falling. So here is a way of summarizing the dynamics of our paper. So start in 1998, at the beginning of the transition, and think that there is an economy where you have households, these are the workers, if you want, who can work either in private firms or in state-owned enterprises. There is a small private entrepreneurial sector, and this private entrepreneurial sector, these entrepreneurs, they also do their savings and their consumption. Now, private entrepreneurs invest in their own business. Workers put their money in the banks, and bank deposit is by large the most dominant form of savings. In the last few years, you have seen that there has been some new development. But you see the savings are channeled into the bank system. The bank system actually could finance the investment in state-owned enterprises or, in principle, also private enterprises. But because of the type of distortion that you have in the system, they do not, or they only do to a limited extent, lending to the private firms. So if there is a sufficient amount of there is a large enough amount of savings, part of the resources that are not absorbed by state-owned enterprises gets parked into foreign assets. In fact, this is in practice only the Chinese central bank owns these foreign assets, but this is not essential. There is a swapping of government bonds with foreign assets and foreign reserves. So here is what happens over time. The economy grows from 1998 to 2004. So initially, this is a small sector. But over time, because of the higher productivity, the domestic private enterprises, those run by entrepreneurs, become more important. And state-owned enterprises actually shrink as a share of total GDP. So more and more of the growing savings of the household get invested into foreign reserves. And in 2010, this becomes even more evident. Actually, there has been some reversion of this process at the time of the Great Recession, but that's somehow the quick visualization of our story. And going back to data, what we see is that the accumulation of foreign reserves tends to co-move with the gap between deposits and loans of the aggregate bank system. Okay? And then the theory has a number of other observations that are consistent with it, which I will not talk about. So now I want to discuss in the last part of my talk something that concerns the future. And I want to start from a couple of problematic observations. The first has to do with the fact that the process of market reform appears to have slowed down. It's true in the narrative. Essentially, if you try to look for big economic reform during the leadership of Hu Jintao, there has been very little. It's also true somehow in the data. For instance, we see that the employment share of state-owned firms has flattened since 2008. So one of my finishing student who was in the market this year has a paper where he argues that this might be a conscious political choice or the result of a political constraint. And somehow the system of China, which is not a democracy, cannot afford the state sector to become too small, because there is evidence that people working in the state sector are much more prone to support the political regime. There's something to do with the rescue package of 2009 that has implied mechanically somehow an increase of the role of the state again in the economy. Something may have to do with the structural change. So there has been a shift towards more capital and technology-intensive sector, and these are traditionally dominated by state-owned enterprises. That can be actually an endogenous outcome of the story I told you before, that in the end, the private sector tends to be more predominant in areas that are less capital-intensive, because capital is more, is where the wedge is most important. So somehow there is a tendency of the state-owned enterprise to retreat in more capital-intensive industries. Another fact that is salient, and there is a recent paper by Chiang Tai-she and Song Zheng, sorry about my bad pronunciation of Chinese, but is that actually part by selection, so the worst state-owned enterprise has already shut down, and part by improvement in the governance, there has been a significant improvement in the performance of state-owned enterprises that remain somehow less productive than domestic enterprises, ceteris paribus, but the gap has been shrinking over time. So what we observe is a slowdown of the process of privatization that I already mentioned. Another of the critical issues about the future of China is its demographic balance. So as a result of the one-child policy introduced in 1978, China has enjoyed a very favorable demographic development from the beginning of reform till today. Oh, no. Oh, okay. I hope this is the only one that's missing. What you would see here is is China, India, and the US was there. So what you would see is the dependency ratio. So the dependency ratio in China, what dependency ratio, as you know, is the ratio between the number of people in age group between 0 and 15 and 65 and plus, who typically do not work, divided by the number of people between 50 and 65. So the dependency ratio was very high in the 1970s because fertility had been very high in the 1960s. The total fertility rate was in the order of 4 at the time. Then, with the family planning policy introduced in the early 70s and the one-child policy in 1978, there has been this big generation has entered the labor force. There were not so many children, so the dependency ratio has plunged, and it has reached the trough around 2011. But now, these big mountains, this big generation that was young in the 1970s that entered the labor force is about, in the years to come, will start retiring. And as it will start retiring, it will not be replaced by a large cohort of young people, because these are the children of the one-child policy. So there are few children who becomes a small cohort of adults. I mean, this is a familiar story that we know also in the West, in the United States and in Europe, about the baby boom, but it's a somehow more dramatic version of it, because the total fertility rate was really high earlier on, and then it went down very, very dramatically. So of course, this mechanically, it means that more people will have to be supported by a smaller number of people. There is also maybe a question about the extent to which this will affect, for instance, the innovativeness of a society. So these were somehow two areas two critical areas. There are a number of areas where actually China's future looks brighter. So first of all, this is something that is very topical in these days. In fact, there is a current discussion within the government and the Communist Party in China. There is still very large scope for further urbanization. So the urbanization rate, the share of the population living in urban area in China has only recently surpassed 50%. Which means that a very large number of people still live in rural areas where the productivity is much lower. So one possibility to counter this negative aggregate demographic balance is to allow a faster process of urbanizations in the year to come. In the past, the process of urbanization has somehow been controlled by making the living condition of those who want to live the rural areas, unless they get formal approval from the authority, quite hard. So actually people can move to areas where they are non-resident, but then they lose any sort of social security, their children don't have access to the public school, etc. So this is one area in which there is ongoing discussion. The second is the economy is actually rapidly turning into very much more innovation-oriented than it has been in the past. So it is often heard that China's growth has been largely due to capital accumulation. It's not entirely true, because I think that, first of all, there was a significant element of total factor productivity growth at the firm level, but also there was a lot of reallocation, as it is discussed in our theory, that was important, but that now somehow the economy, it's changing its structure and becoming more dependent of innovation, and I will show you some data that shows that actually the R&D intensity of China is increasing. Human capital accumulation is also a very important area where big changes are occurring, so the rate of the enrollment rate have increased dramatically in the last 10 years. So this is something very recent. And so we expect a large cohort of well-educated people to enter the labor force in the years to come. Let me give you just some pictures. This one is here, so I was nervous that we will see everything white. Here you see how actually the population will evolve. This is based on a model that in one of our recent paper, where you can see that although the total population has almost reached the plateau, the urban population has a potential to continue to grow for quite a few decades. R&D expenditure is the second area that I mentioned. Well, China in this respect is behaving very differently from the set of other emerging economies. So this was discussed today in one of the sessions in the conference. I mean, China in the 1990s was not particularly important in terms of its expenditure in R&D. Its level of expenditure was comparable to that of other emerging economies. So it was below 1% of the GDP. But now it has gone above 2%. So as you know, we know that there is a systematic relationship between innovation intensity and stage of development. So middle income economy typically invests a lower share in formal R&D than do developed economies. This was true for China in the 1990s, but this is what has happened throughout the last decade. So now China has invest a higher share of the GDP than Italy. Well, that's not so difficult, but also than the United Kingdom. Well, the other aspect I was mentioning was this that we call emphatically the new cultural revolution. I mean, the generation that has made the economic miracle was largely trained in a system that probably was not providing the necessarily the best skill for being productive in the workforce. And in the last few years, we have seen a very large increase in the supply of skills, and at the same time, a very high increase in the wages of highly educated workers. There is a recent paper published in GIA by Jay and Yang that shows that over a long period, I think it was 15 years, the average growth rate of the wages for people with college degree in urban area, living in urban areas, is 12%. So it's an amazing increase also of the inequality, because the people without skills, the corresponding figure is below 6%. Okay? So there seems to be an increasing demand for these type of skills, and the system seems to be providing for more of those skills through the education system. So already the proportion of the population 25 or more in tertiary education today, it's 6 times as in the 1980s. This is actually of the working population. Sorry, it's a bit ugly written. The tertiary enrollment rate is 27%. So the number of fresh college graduates is up from less than 1 million in 2001 to over 6 million in 2010. Let alone the number of students that go overseas and that they provide some skills when they return, at least those who return. And if you think about quality, well, certainly there's a lot of diversity, but the only formal evidence we have is the last PISA study, which has only looked at the performance of Shanghai students, while Shanghai students perform better on average than the Finnish students, who have always the role model for Europe. In fact, they perform on the top of the set of countries. Okay, let me leave alone this. Something that I think can provide an important engine for economic growth is the reform of the financial sector. So the financial sector in China is overregulated and very distorted, as I was mentioning before. So one of the big distortions is that domestic private enterprises cannot have access to bank loan as much as they would like. So there is a heavy discrimination against private small medium enterprises that is well documented in the data. The other aspect is that domestic savers earn low return in spite of the fact that there are investment opportunities that yield a very high rate of return. So how can this be explained? Well, largely by the set of regulation. Currently, it's not forbidden to set up new banks in China, or at least from Chinese banks. But those banks are subject to the regulation that prevent them from offering competitive deposit rates. So that is a very powerful way of maintaining the monopoly of the 4 large state-owned banks. So this is one of the reasons why the domestic savers actually earn so low returns. So on the one hand, there are domestic savers who are thirsty of high returns. On the other hand, there are firms that are willing to pay high interest rates for borrowing resources. Well, the outcome of this set of constraints we have seen in the recent few years. This has been the explosion of off-balance sheet lending. This phenomenon takes actually a variety of different forms. It is in partly a way for provincial and municipal governments to raise funds because they cannot issue bonds, but it's also a way for private firms, especially in some sector, to raise funds and to roundabout the system that characterized by financial repression and overregulation. So incidentally, this is creating a lot of debate and discussion in the media. Some argue that there is a risk of a Lehman moment for China. The authorities are facing a dilemma. They have tolerated it so far, but if some of these intermediaries get into trouble, are they supposed to bail out or not? In the declaration, they say that they will not bail out, but of course there is the risk of some type of systemic crisis. Now, in reality, this type of systemic crisis seems to be rather unlikely. First of all, the shadow banking has, in terms of size, it accounts for 50 to 70% of the GDP in the most generous estimates. In the United States, the same type of phenomenon accounts for 170% of the GDP. So it's still relatively limited. And if you think that just the foreign reserves owned by the Chinese central bank account for about 50% of the GDP, then you can see that even just in terms of potential bailout, it's very hard to think that this will create a systemic crisis. Partly because if one looks at the type of contracts that are of which this consists of, it's mostly simple contracts that are localized. So it's a firm that wants to raise some money for a project. They cannot actually borrow directly from another firm, and then an intermediary is created that takes position on both sides. There is no generalized securitization, for instance, that can generate the type of spread of the phenomenon that we have seen in the US. And the other thing is that Chinese banks tend to be very well capitalized. So again, it's possible that someone has to run losses. It seems unlikely that this will take the system on its knees. More important, I believe that financial reforms could become an engine of economic growth if the process of growth wants to continue to be sustained. The last chapter, how much have I? Maybe I should. Okay. So the last thing the last topic I wanted to mention is the growing inequality and the particular aspect of it. So there is a sense in which growth has been insufficiently inclusive in China, and this is creating increasing discontent. So though, as I have argued, it has still implied a growth in the living condition also of the poorest people, the inequality per se can become a source of concern for the social cohesion of the system. And actually this has become, since the days of Wen Jiabao, who is no longer the premier, has been replaced by Li Keqiang, but there has been a lot of emphasis on making growth maybe less fast, but more inclusive, and worrying more about inequality. So part of the issue concern the fact that the type of institutions that, at least in Europe, are quite pervasive, welfare state institutions, are actually rather underdeveloped in China. One of the key elements of debate has been the pension system of China. So China has a pension system that was introduced in 1997, once the old communist type of pension was abandoned. In 1997, these pensions were run by the municipalities, and in principle, firms had to contribute to the municipality pensions, but that was not happening, or at least these pension systems were systematically underfunded. So they were bailed out repeatedly, and also there was a declining coverage of the pension system. At some point, if I remember correctly, about 40%, only 40% of the urban labor force was covered, and there was no rural pension, which is largely still the case. They have recently introduced a limited system. So with the reform of 2005, they have both somehow made it less generous for the pension recipient and increased the coverage of the system. The system is a bit complicated in the rules because it's a multi-pillar system where part of it is a standard redistributive pension, and the part is defined benefits with. So there's a part with defined benefits and part that is based on individual accounts. And I don't have the time to get into the fine details. But what I want to emphasize, because this is part of a recent paper where we have been working with Chelsea Torres-Lett and Song Zhang and Ikai Wang, is that there is a parallel between the experience of the welfare state in the West and the experience of and the role of pension in China. The parallel is the following. to a large extent, the build-up of the pension system in Europe and also in the United States has made it possible to operate some sort of social bailout of generations that had been hit by large shocks, first the Great Depression and then World War II. Now, of course, this has built up a debt that has been left to the future generations and that we are now worried about. So this is an implicit liability that continues to be there. Now, for China, the parallel is that if you take someone who is retired, someone who entered the labor force in 1917 and someone who entered the labor force in 2010, given the going wage growth, the present value of income is, the difference is a factor of 6. So that means that there is a case from the social point of view for granting a generous deal to those generations that otherwise risk not benefiting at all from the high growth that China has enjoyed. Of course, this will leave a burden if the system is run in a not financially balanced way. It will leave a burden to the future generations, but we have also to remember that those generations will be much richer than the current generations are. So what we argue, sorry, I said 2010 and I should have said 2000. That's the right number. Okay, so in this paper that I've mentioned, we calculate using the standard tool in macroeconomics, so the construction of a social planner that discounts future generation with some geometric discount rate. We calculate what is the desirable pension arrangement from the point of view of a social planner that has no desire to redistribute when the economy is in a steady state. So if you put that social planner in a mature economy, that social planner would not want to redistribute across generation. It requires a social discount rate which is very low, 0.5% per year. Well, even one such planner would agree that you would want to redistribute resources from the future generation to the current generation. And what we find is actually that a system that, so what in particular we do is, well, the current rules are not sustainable in the long run. So you would have to reduce the generosity of the current pension system from a replacement rate of essentially 60% to a replacement rate of 40%. We could do it today, or we could do it in 30 years. What is better? Well, what is better, if you take the perspective of the planner I just described, is actually to delay the process of reform. And this is somehow, from the policy relevance point of view, important because there is a lot of discussion. And there is a lot of also concern about the fact that the adverse demographic dynamics will make it unsustainable to have a generous pension system. And some of the proposals on the ground are to essentially scrap the current system and introduce a fully funded system similar to the one of the reform of 1980 in Chile. Well, our study puts some warning and says, well, if there is a concern about dealing with inequality and social injustice, this goes exactly in the wrong way. Okay, I think it's time for me to come to conclusion. So this is actually the first point is about a slide that I have not presented, but let me show you at least the picture. So this is our in the paper where we calculate the value of different alternative pension reforms, we have to make some forecasts about the future economic growth of China. And based on the type of consideration I gave you and on some calibration that I will not enter in the fine details, what we expect is a path of this type. And if you think about what will happen in the next 10 years, so in the long run, this is a path of convergence that would put China in the same, relative to the United States, be similar to what is today South Korea. What would this path that looks very optimistic imply? Well, a rate of growth until 2030 of the order of an average 6%. So the current path of China is somehow, this we did it a few years ago, is somehow in line with this. Of course, there is large uncertainty about it. But I mean, considering the set of forces and also the mere potential of growth by convergence and technological convergence, we argue that it's unlikely to see that China will actually collapse. Let me retrieve to my last slide. Don't remember all the points by memory. Sorry about that. Oh, okay. So we also see a transition from investment-driven to innovation growth and to innovation-driven growth, and process of human capital accumulation has accelerated. We expect, I've not discussed this, but we expect a growing role of the internal demand and an acceleration of wages. We think that financial market reforms are important and should have a key role in the policy reform agenda. And finally, that instrument of redistribution that redistribute the benefit of this high growth across the population are important for sustainability. Now, there's something that we have not done and that I will, we can discuss and speculate somehow, which is political changes. Not because I think that China has an ideal political system, so I hope, like most people in this room, that there are at some point a process of democratization is started. It's very hard, in my view, to foresee changes in that respect in the short term, at least. Thank you.
If there are questions,
yeah, sure. Please, if you want to. I was a bit long, but please. Yes, please. Oh.
Wait, hello?
Yep.
Okay, I think we don't have too many Chinese here, but you, in the very end, you mentioned about the changes in the political structure itself. So I want to hear more about, your point on this view, since I think, as you have shown to us, it's a lot of this abnormal effects are due to this distortions from political systems, but the political systems themselves are not exogenous given. So see, for the next 10 or 20 years, what do you think about the interaction between this the political system and also the economic outcomes? Okay.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I think this answer will be largely speculative. I think the useful benchmark is given by the work of Yikai Wang, my student. So he argues that the same system with its distortion that have been in place during the past years may have been responsible to some extent of the faster growth. Why? Well, essentially because some of the distortion, the main distortion introduced by the system have caused a compression of wages. So he argues that there is that the government somehow introduces distortion that favor the state-owned enterprises, and this distortion has a general equilibrium effect. They keep artificially low the wages that are paid by private enterprises. So this has both peace with the middle class. So in particular for the entrepreneurs that might value, the middle class is often regarded as the the engine of changes that brings about demand for democratization. That seems to be quite limited in China nowadays. In fact, he has some data that show that, whatever you can think about running a survey of political issues in China, but differentially speaking, it seems that people belonging to what he defines as a middle class are, if anything, less supportive of changes in the direction of democracy than the rest of the population. Now, when this, in some way, his argument is that this distortion has helped compensate for other existing distortion in the capital markets, but at the same time, it can come to the point, again, it's his view, that because they want to artificially keep alive a state sector that is less efficient, well, then this lower efficiency can be exacerbated by the political distortion. So somehow there is a view that this political distortion may become more may have a bigger bite in the years to come. So my impression is that this may become important, especially if there is a negative shock and China stops growing at a high rate. But I don't think that this is going to happen in the very short run. But at the same time, you're right in hinting at the fact that this distortion may actually be themselves responsible for the slowdown of growth. At least this is the outcome of his study. If you ask Daron Acemoglu, he will tell you that this will happen in the next few months. If you ask me, I say I'm less sure about that. Yep.
So do you think the housing market bubble, or if there is a crash in the housing market, this will not hit China too badly?
Well, first of all, it's highly debated if there is such a bubble. I mean, some of the studies I've seen argue that it's actually more, the situation is somehow more tricky in smaller cities than in the big cities. Now, one of the issue about the housing market is how it's related to this new and creative form of financing. So a lot of the part of this shadow banking and this collection of resources through non-bank intermediaries has used land as collateral. So there is a risk that something like what has happened in Spain actually happens. It's a risk that I think, I mean, the housing market has cooled down at the moment. So I think that there is one such a risk. I don't think it will have the type of consequences that we have seen in the United States, for instance, because this type of so the crisis will have a much more local effect. We don't see big securitization. I don't think that there will be a lot of domino effect like we have seen in the West. Thank you.